They gathered outside the gates, picketing and chanting slogans, preventing other students from entering the schools to sit for the exams. The day was 27th November 1961, and these students were protesting against having to sit for a government examination introduced for Secondary 4 students in Chinese schools. This was not the first time that Chinese students had agitated against the authorities. In 1954, they took to the streets to protest against British attempts to introduce national service in Singapore. A year later, in the Hockley bus dispute, they provided much emotional support and material aid to the striking bus workers, supporting a strike which escalated into a violent riot. And when the government decided to close their schools to instill discipline among the students, they organized a sit-in. Those days, Chinese school students were fired by the call for independence to end colonial rule, and many were inspired by events in China.
当时学生活动呢，一般人士啊，感觉到他们是左倾啊。那么这个左倾原因呢，我们可以说，因为当时是殖民地时代，那么大家我们是华人，都认为中国是我们的祖国，是吧？中华文化是我们的根。那么中国当时呢是共产党执政，当然是左了，所以呢，无形中呢，学生的就倾向于左。
Since they were first set up in the 18th century, Chinese schools in Singapore were patterned after those in China. Teachers and even textbooks came from there. For the Chinese, education was an important way of preserving their language and culture, and they were therefore very proud of their schools. There were English schools, but these were mainly set up by the Europeans, and they functioned on a different system. In the late 50s, however, the government saw a need to unify the educational system. Singapore was moving away from the crutches of colonial rule, and it became necessary for all schools to have the same curriculum. The government recommended that the Chinese school system be changed to follow that of the English schools. There was no change at the primary level, as primary education would still be 6 years. But the change affected the secondary schools. Previously, Chinese school students attended 3 years of lower middle and another 3 years of senior middle school, with examinations set by the schools themselves. But now, just as in English schools, they would have to attend 4 years of secondary school, at the end of which they would sit for an examination set by the government. Only after passing the exam would they be able to do 2 more years of pre-university. This new system was implemented in 1959, but there were those in the Chinese community who did not like the change.
他们同时呢也怀疑政府呢有意要改制，是要把华文中学改制同英校一样，慢慢的把华校变制为英校。 这样呢，就把华校破坏了，最后呢，消灭华文教育。
The students took up this issue in July 1961, the year the first government exams for Secondary 4 students were to be held. They were very much against the fact that they had to pass their Secondary 4 exam before they could do pre-university. They were supported by pro-communist elements in the Barisan Socialists, a newly formed party set up by former members of the People's Action Party. Many believe that the Barisan Socialists was the main influence behind the student agitation, and that the party was using the issue to arouse discontent among the people. Two days before the exams, some 5,000 students gathered at the Chinese high school for a meeting. There they took a combined decision to boycott the exam. On the first day of the exam, they gathered outside the various exam centers. The students chanted slogans, clapped hands and sang to keep their spirits up. They masked their faces with handkerchiefs and wore black armbands to mourn the death of Chinese education. Some who had turned up for the exam were persuaded to boycott it. Others were prevented from entering the exam centers. Over the next few days, the boycott continued to gain momentum. Most of the 18 examination venues had to be closed. The students even picketed outside the Ministry of Education.
教育部的是那个入口处，主要入口处的话呢，也集中了很多学生在那边。这些学生的话呢，慢慢的也越来越多，越来越多的话，他们也在那边，当然了，唱歌啦，喊口号啦。
Temporary exam venues had to be found. In the end, only 3 centers were opened for the exams. But despite the boycott, more than half the candidates sat for the examinations. This was mainly due to the efforts of their parents, who were undeterred by the boycotting students. They accompanied their children to the exam venues and were prepared to push their way through the human blockade. The government had not used the police, but instead convinced the parents that sitting for the exams would be in their children's best interests.
Student boycott examination, no police. I use the police, students are injured, Chinese education being destroyed. I just tell the parents, look, your boy misses this examination, he loses 1 year. The parent sits back for 24 hours, thinks about it, grabs hold of his son, breaks the picket line, goes in and sees that his son is in the examination.
Without the support of the parents, the boycott simply failed. This marked a turning point in the attitude of Chinese secondary school students. Slowly, a new generation of students was emerging. They saw the importance of education and the need to advance themselves. The political climate was also changing. Under a government that was popularly elected, the people were beginning to witness changes for the better. And as the immigrant communities began to regard Singapore as home, they were prepared to leave the turbulence of the 50s behind and to accept the need for change.